I'm a big believer in second chances, even for people who commit serious crimes. Who deserves a second chance? Who gets one? And who decides? I'm Jessica Henry, and I'll be your host of Just Justice. I'm a former public defender, a professor of justice studies, and an award-winning author. And I'm excited for us to find new ways to put justice back into our criminal legal system. Hello and welcome to Just Justice. My name is Jessica Henry, and I'll be your host. Today we have the pleasure of talking with award-winning journalist Justine Leun, who joins us to discuss her new book, Unreasonable Women, 3 Stories of Violence, Imprisonment, and Extraordinary Survival. It's a sweeping investigation into how the criminal legal system punishes women who survive abuse. Drawing on 7 years of reporting and more than 1,000 accounts from incarcerated women across the country, Leun examines the hidden realities of criminalized survival through the stories of 3 women who, after enduring years of violence and trauma, ultimately killed in order to survive. This is a powerful conversation about abuse. But I do want to warn our listeners that we'll be talking a little bit about, or a lot about, physical violence, sexual violence, trauma, and the way our criminal legal system responds to it all. Justine, welcome so much to Just Justice.
Thank you so much.
So let me just ask you broadly, what first drew you into the subject?
I always say it was one woman, Nikki Armando. Nikki. I was reporting on immigration. I was reporting out of South Africa. I was traveling a lot. And when I had my second daughter, I decided I wanted to work a little closer to home. And I really wanted to work on women's issues. So I happened upon this case in Poughkeepsie, New York. And when I think about it now, it's just like, it was so small at the time, but it became like my whole life, basically. But it was a case of a woman named Nikki Armando. It's a fairly well-known case now. She was a young mom in Poughkeepsie who basically killed her abuser, and she was being prosecuted for murder. And she killed him in self-defense. She claimed, and I believe. But yeah, so I followed that trial. I wrote a lot about that trial. I wrote a lot about that case. I did a podcast on that case, and through my reporting on that, I just came to find that criminalized survival, which is, this phenomenon in which mostly women are arrested, prosecuted, incarcerated for actions they took to survive physical or sexual violence. I just saw that as being extremely widespread, but I wanted to prove it. So I started this large-scale project. I wrote to over 10,000 women in prison. I received over 1,000 responses. And it became a book that focuses on 3 women's stories and also pulls the data from all of those letters.
And I mean, just to pause for 1 second, because you kind of just said it like, yeah, and I wrote 10,000 letters, but that was a massive undertaking. As you soon found out, you can't necessarily put labels on envelopes. You had to handwrite a lot of these letters. That's a lot of letters for you to have written.
Yes, I think that what happened was I sort of thought somebody suggested the idea, hey, you can learn these hidden stories if you write. The women, an attorney who worked with criminalized survivors told me that. And I got so excited that I think I didn't really uh, have any realistic idea of what I was getting myself into. But once I got myself into it, because, I got a 10% response rate, which is quite good, especially because people in prison, have many hindrances. But I really started to become obsessed with getting 1,000 responses. Like, I just really wanted 1,000 voices. I thought, like, who can deny 1,000 women's voices? Um, so that ended up because, I ended up having to kind of write out 10,000 to get the 1,000 letters back. But yes, I did not. I think in a way, COVID helped me a little bit because I was doing this during COVID and there was really nothing else to do. Like, you could, just you had time to sit, handwrite letters, get things made. So, but yes, it was a large undertaking that I did not fully anticipate when I started.
And you targeted women who were incarcerated for murder and for manslaughter. So you sort of defined this large population with curiosity. You were sort of saying, I wonder how many women serving sentences for some form of homicide are doing so in the context of having survived abuse. And that's a really fascinating question that you were working with.
Well, I had had a lot of people in this what I saw happen to Nikki was so bizarre to me, because I had all these documents, I had all of the discovery. I don't know how I got the discovery, like, because I didn't FOIA it, but I somehow came upon it in my reporting. So, I had much of it, and I was looking through everything, and I was talking to the people around her, and there were so many police reports. She had so much evidence to show that she had been abused. And then when I saw like, what I could see in my original reporting versus the state's, uh, narrative that was being put forth, they just had nothing to do with each other. But, of course, the state is very convincing, as you know, like, they don't they know how to make a case and what they need to do. So, I was just curious, like, she's quite traditionally feminine, she's quite conventionally pretty, she's small, she's white, she lives in this middle class area, and, like, this is happening to her. So what is happening, across America? And when I talked to experts in the space, they all were completely nonplussed. They just said, "Yeah, this happens. This is what our women's prisons are full of people like this." But nobody had the data. Nobody could prove it. They could just say it anecdotally. Everybody said it, but, like, I thought, "Let's see if we can show it."
Yeah, I mean it's a fascinating project, and I want to come back to Nikki in just a little bit, but she's actually not the focus of your book. You chose to focus instead on three women: Tanisha Williams, Gemma Heffernan, and T.C. Brooks. And I'm wondering, why did you choose them, and what connected these three stories for you?
Yeah, I do weave Nikki in a little, but she's not one of the focuses of the book. So I received all of these letters, these more than 1,000 letters and surveys from what I sent in. And I think the first person I picked Tanisha because her story was um, let's see. So one of the things I needed several things from the people that I picked. One, because with normal reporting, you are going around with someone, you can hang out, you can be in their life, and you can kind of take in who they are and how they conduct themselves. If you're reporting on someone in the prison, you can't hang out with them. So I really needed people who were very good at communicating, who were very, very enthusiastic and really able to keep a project going remotely essentially. I did go meet them in prison, but I can't go hang out in prison. So I really needed that, and so I remember finding Tanisha, and she was so enthusiastic, she was so all in, her story was fascinating, and, um, another thing about her story was because she had been, a state witness because her co-defendant, actually killed this man, she was just there essentially, um there was a lot of documentation that I could pull from, so that was great because, I can't just tell these stories, I need to back them up, particularly in this subject matter. Gemma Heffernan also had a lot of background documentation, but also her mother had been involved with her crime of conviction, so her mother was out and could really help me navigate that story, and that was super helpful, could take me around, could show me. Um and, TC was the same very, very verbal person who can really write and can really communicate. But the other reason that I picked all three is that they had similar through lines in all their stories. This childhood trauma, often intergenerational. I found this was often a book about mothers and daughters, which I wasn't expecting. Childhood sexual trauma, state failures, all that. But each story was super distinct, and also kind of brought up nuances of criminalized survival, like Gemma was straight self-defense, I think she could claim. She didn't get that, but she claimed that. TC killed her childhood abuser. Tanisha was in the room when somebody else killed somebody. So they're all different ways that this subject works and quite nuanced.
Yeah, and where were they geographically? How disparate was it?
I did want it to be like sort of spread out across the country, but of course you only get so many things that you really exactly want. So it's Missouri is where Gemma is, Michigan is where Tanisha is, and California is where TC is.
And then again, Nikki was in New York.
And
So
Nikki was New York, yeah.
yeah, so that's a nice, I mean, that is a broad swath of the country.
It is.
And they all ultimately were treated the same in some ways, right? Which is that their abuse as a excuse or mitigating factor wasn't really taken fully into account. Um, and before we go a little bit more deeply into their cases, I'm wondering if you could say a little bit more about the patterns that you saw between these women and the women that you heard from in those 1,000 letters. You mentioned, for instance, the idea of childhood abuse being something that seemed very common among many of these women.
I think almost universal. In the survey, I never asked anybody, for example, like, were you abused as a child? I didn't want to prime people. It was really general questions, and I was drawing from that. Later, I sort of wished I had primed them because I would have gotten much easier data back. But, but, for example, so I think that I was not able to capture the kind of the people that I've talked to in prison, in women's prisons, almost can't count a single person that they know in prison who hasn't been abused as a child. Um, so that is, like, a through line that I saw, but I didn't even see that necessarily as much as it happens because, like, for example, when Tanisha had a childhood with so much sexual abuse, so much physical violence, so much neglect, her first letter to me didn't say that. It just showed that in that moment, it suggested that in the moment that she of the crime that she was convicted of, she was basically forced to do it. Um, but so yes, she was not unusual. All of them had what I thought was interesting was that all of them had these childhoods in which the state did not provide, um, any safety, any adequate resources, maybe no resources whatsoever. There was nowhere for them to go, in the richest country in the world to get any help, and yet, after they had reacted to that abuse and that failure, the state was suddenly incredibly rich, quite effective, very vigorous in punishing them forever.
Yeah, I mean, this is a show, Just Justice is a show that looks at second chances. And, one of the pushback that I sometimes get is, well, there wasn't a first chance, right? And the state stood by while so much, to your point, of violence and abuse created trauma for so many people. And yet they were at the ready to pounce as soon as there was a crime involved. So yeah, I very much hear what you're saying there. And in these cases, these women were not clearly, and I'm putting this in quotation marks, perfect victims. You refer to them as not perfect victims. What would be a perfect victim, and how were they not the perfect victim? And how does that play out in the criminal legal system? And is that too many questions?
No, that's great. I mean, I think that, the number one requirement for a perfect victim is dead. So she needs to be dead to be perfect victim. That's the only way you can say, um, it was really serious, it was really happening. But even then, of course, we see, even in death, we see, like, women not being believed or what happened downplayed or it being called a crime of passion or his mental health struggles caused this. Um, so dead is one main requirement that none of the women that I reported on were able to achieve. Um, and then, I think I think the Nikki case was so interesting because she really had almost everything that you needed to be a perfect victim: white, straight, small, feminine, appearing, in this middle class world, not taking drugs, not a sex worker, and not any of the things that sort of more marginalized or vulnerable women contend with. And still, she was, um, I think her victimhood in a way, like, the fact that she had been sexually abused by her partner, in a way, it seemed to me erased. It She became guilty through the abuse that happened to her. Like, I think there was something that happened in the courtroom, and I think research backs this up, that when sexuality is brought up for women, whether it was rape, or not, but that their sexuality is, like, evoked, they become they're perceived as more guilty. So the fact of being a victim, like, makes you more guilty, in the eyes of, I think, the public and the jury. But yeah, and then, TC in the book, she is a lesbian, and she always presented, sort of as, like, she would call herself a butch lesbian, like, short hair, like, very sort of, not performing femininity the way that we like. I think my feeling is she was punished for that on the stand, that she wasn't the correct type of girl to be abused. How could someone like that be abused? Um, I think, Tanisha is Black. She was a sex worker. She lived in a very depressed city, and she was very poor. So all of those things, of course, make her not the perfect victim, even though we know that, like, sex workers are victimized constantly, but nonetheless. And then you know, Gemma should have also been kind of like a perfect victim because she's blonde and white and she was in this military family. But when she was a teenager, she was raped by a guy in the town. And when she came forward, her family, and they really bought into the system. I mean, they were in the military. They really bought into the whole idea of the justice system and what's right is right. They were very shocked to see that as soon as she got involved in, like, a he said, she said thing, even though she was 13 years old, the system would not support them. And from there, her experience being so betrayed by not just the rapist, but by the system after that, I think really kind of started her life, took her life in a different direction. So she was not perfect after that. And she was not perfect because she didn't leave, and we know why people can't and don't. But, like, I think a lot of the blame went to her for staying in an abusive relationship that ended in the death of her partner, where if you read the book, you will see there was no way to leave. It wasn't really her choice one way or another. And when she was trying to leave is when everything happened.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, it's so interesting because my first book and research and writing has looked at women in the context of wrongful convictions. And it's very similar when women don't sort of fit into that traditional role of woman, mother, perfect, whatever. It's often used, weaponized against them and held against them in ways that sort of imply criminality when none was there. So, it's very interesting. There's a way in which women as defendants, women as people brought in the criminal legal system are treated very differently than men. Um, and you also mentioned this idea of, well, we all know why women don't leave, but I don't know that people actually do know why women don't leave abusive situations. So I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about what you learned in the process of doing this research.
Yeah, I mean, and people get very annoyed in the sort of domestic violence advocacy space. Like, why didn't she leave? They get very annoyed at that question. I think it's a question I know that I've had people, who just don't know about the topic say, like, they are confused, because when they hear quickly the story, oh, he was beating her up, like, why didn't she leave? I think in the I think it's really hard to understand from the outside why, and I think in this book, I tried to also write in detail the actual situations that these women were in where they couldn't leave, or it wasn't really a choice in the way that one of us would make a free choice. Um, so first of all, we know the data shows that leaving is the most dangerous time. We saw it in the Justin Fairfax case. We saw it in the Louisiana Shreveport child killings just recently. In both of those situations, the woman was leaving. Um, Serena Fairfax was leaving. The wife, the mother of those 8 children or those 7 children, and another child was trying to leave. So you look at and I saw this play out. Nikki was trying to leave, in her case. Gemma was trying to leave. Tanisha wanted to leave, but she was dealing with not having housing, so she was staying because her choice was leave, and sleep in your car or stay and sleep in a bed. So she wasn't making a choice like I would make a choice, necessarily. I think also for women, um children are, like, a huge factor because if you are also, say, not the breadwinner or you don't have financial freedom, as is in many of these cases, and you have children, what is your choice really to, like, take your children out of their whole life, um, and away from their dad, who they may or may not really love, and, take them to, like, a shelter or what if these women don't they don't it you just be people become very trapped, and then when they do try to leave is often when was the majority of homicides happen. I think domestic violence homicide, if I might get it wrong, is in within the year or the year and a half after leaving is when they get killed, like, the most. So it's just a very dangerous time, and it's not some and it takes, I think, the average person 7 times to attempts to leave a domestic violence situation, because I think what people don't understand is that it's not really about if she wants to leave, it's about if he decides to let her leave. Like, he is the one making the decision, is she gonna be able to leave or not, ultimately? And if he decides no, then she has put herself in a very dangerous situation.
Yeah, and I mean, it is so tricky. Like, I remember I used to be a public defender, and that was also a question that came up. Well, why didn't she just walk away when she could? And the ties that bind, are very strong, and the leaving, to your point, is very complex and often dangerous. And there's also, and you talk about this in your book, and I'm wondering if you could talk about it here, no obvious recourse, right? Because the police, for instance, failed each of the women in your book on multiple occasions when they tried to get the help they needed.
Yeah, I mean, the police are just part of the larger culture, so we see all of the attitudes, like, permeating through, But, yeah, I think in Gemma's case, there was a moment that stuck out to me. She had tried to leave her abusive husband, um, so many times, called police. He would go to jail for a little, he'd be out, and there was one point at which she had left him, and she was picking up her son at school. She'd even done her timing to make, like, the timing work so that she would come later so that he couldn't find them, or earlier or something, but I think what she didn't know, and she really didn't come to terms with for a long time, is that he was tracking her, which a lot of, like, women in these situations are unknowingly being tracked on their phones or whatever. So he found her, he attacked her, and then when the police were called, he ran off. And the police came and they said, like, they just offered her no actual solution. They just said, "Ma'am, you've just gotta leave this guy, it's only gonna get worse." And it was like, "Yeah, but she did leave him, but he found her, that's why we're here right now." So there was never any offer to any of these women of anything that they could realistically take, um, and no resources that they knew of to use to get out. And then it didn't even work, like, if you see Nikki, she was trying to build evidence, she was trying to build, like, bit by bit, so when if she did need to leave and it did become necessary, she would be able to have all evidence. She built it, and in court after she killed her partner, they really just took all of that evidence and tried to render it totally meaningless and turn it around and say, it didn't yeah. So
So let's talk about that, about the treatment of women in court, because, you think of prosecutors, they're supposed to be ministers of justice. They're supposed to, in a courtroom setting, it's supposed to be this adversarial system. To the extent somebody goes to trial, right? And that's something else I found very interesting in your book as an aside. We know that like 95, 96% of all cases are resolved by guilty plea, but a much higher percentage of women actually go to trial, right? Putting their in these contexts. I think your book said something like 56% of something. I think that's right. I can
I don't yeah, we would both have to look it up, but yeah.
a high percentage of women actually go to trial, maybe because they believe the system will see what they did and understand their choices. But what do you think prosecutors are so willing to overlook overwhelming evidence of domestic violence and abuse as a contributing factor to what occurred? And sometimes as a complete defense to what occurred. Like, why do you think what was your experience? What did you learn? What did you see?
My mom doesn't really know about these topics, and she read the book, and she was like, "These effing prosecutors," She was so annoyed. I said, "Yeah, like, nobody knows it it's a very frustrating thing to watch," and often you see with like the legislation that, for survivors of violence and maybe can they get mitigating circumstances when that's going through in the courts. It's like MAGA people and leftists can often come to an agreement on this one thing. And yet you will find that like the prosecutors association will nonetheless be like the only entity that's against these survivor acts, these legislations. I think several things are going on. First of all, I think, as you know, winning is rewarded more than justice. So I think people want wins. I think once they've been assigned a case or told to fight a case, it becomes about making, and I've had an attorney named Lee Goodmark who works in this space. I think she once said, it's about making the facts fit your worldview. So like you have a worldview and you have a goal, and then you make all the facts fit that rather than, and they're supposed to, as you say, do justice, but really they're rewarded for winning,
And
for
winning,
convictions.
right, winning is defined as convictions. That it's not necessarily about what's just.
Yeah. And I think, prosecutors know very well that it's a bit of a show, right? It's a bit of a like I think Nikki's prosecutor had been like a theater minor or something. There's a level of theatrics to a courtroom. And so they're not necessarily adhering to the truth. They're doing what it takes to win. And I think that they know, usually because they're experienced in this, that it's very effective to paint a woman with the stereotypes that people react badly to. If you can call her a slut or imply that she's a malingerer, things that, are typically put on women, then you can really get a jury or a judge to find her guilty and to disbelieve her. And the more sort of on the margins the person is, the easier that is to do.
Can you give us any examples, for instance, of what tropes prosecutors relied on in the course of a prosecution for the women that you focused on?
There's a lot of reframing domestic violence as like a tumultuous, toxic relationship when it's really just somebody who's basically sexually assaulting and brutalizing the other. They'll be like, Romeo and Juliet, but it's really not in any way, this fiery relationship. It's an abusive relationship. But that way makes it sound like they're both really equally liable. They're both involved in something weird when really he's just doing something very, harmful to her. There's certainly, I know in Tanisha's trial, I remember the prosecutor saying, she's not living with her kids. And by the way, she was living with one of her kids. So, for like the bad mother trope, she wasn't living with her kids. He mentioned she's a prostitute, he called her, to kind of, he said she was living a wasted life. That's very subjective. She was actually working, paying taxes at that time. She was going on the straight and narrow. She was helping the state. She was raising her daughter. But he could very easily just call her a prostitute, living a wasted life. He also called her and her co-defendants jackals, which I think is a racially charged way of dehumanizing them. But it's subtle, right? You say it and you hook into all of the biases and prejudices of the jury, but nobody can really see that in the moment, or it gets passed by. But I mean, people notice it, but it's like, I think it's quite purposeful. And there's certainly another way of taking sexual violence or sexual assault and calling it like that she liked it, that it was kink, she was into it. Yeah, now she's saying it was rape, but it wasn't. It was she was into this kinky stuff, and so maybe it was a little screwed up. But so they're like downplaying all the abuse, and then I think often calling women fakers, whiners. If a woman has a pattern of being abused over a lifetime, I saw it time and time again, they would kind of imply, like, what's really wrong with her? Like, it's not like what's wrong with all the guys that abused her, but it'd be like, do we really believe this? Suddenly she's been abused by everyone. Like, let's really think about it. But really, that's actually how it works. People are often in repeated abusive situations. So it would just be, as somebody told me, the throw the spaghetti at the wall approach, throw it all at the wall and see what sticks.
Yeah. Yeah. And juries seem to also not fully appreciate or understand or believe the role of trauma in these cases. right? You actually spoke to a couple of jurors.
I mean, I think I don't know this for sure, and I would be interested to hear if you think this, but I think often the kind of person that gets picked for a jury is like a pretty conventional person. I didn't find many, radical artists or something on it. It was like a lot of like teachers and doctors and you know, administrators, people. So I think that it's a jury pool is already like a pretty like they didn't get out of serving jury duty. You know what I mean? They're there. Um and they're definitely I think, you know, they're charged also with like really the letter of the law. So I found like in Nikki's case, a big question with imminence. Was it self-defense because self-defense is so connected to the idea of was she in imminent danger? And
Well, in TC's case too, right? That was a big issue.
well, TC's case is a little more complicated because she basically I think they, like, denied everything in their initial trial. It was really bungled. I mean, that was back in, I believe, 1989, 1990, so it was a long time ago, but later when she came forward to tell the truth, she had a story, but that case is a little more confusing because of the no, I mean, because, like, at first they kind of just said they didn't do it, and later kind of I think TC then took the fall. It was a bit more confused, but, like, for Nikki's case, he was lying down. The prosecution says he was asleep. I actually believe her that he wasn't. Um, but that the fact that he was lying down created a nice way for prosecution to go in and say, like, there was no imminence. He was lying down.
And when you
But
say no imminence, you mean no immediate threat of violence, lethal violence.
right, but of course, imminence, like, is kind of not there's no rule of the amount of time. So was she in imminent danger in, like, the millisecond? Who knows? But, like, to her she says within 3 seconds. Like, they created a world in which she could have left, she could have run out. I don't see that world. Her kids are in another room behind her, and the door is there, and if this man is armed, I feel that sh and also has sexually tortured her, physically abused her for years and years. I see imminence a different way than the jury wanted to see imminence in that case, but I also think I would say I think juries often, because they live in our culture and they live in this sort of patriarchal society, do look for excuses to find women guilty often. Um, and women, I did not find, like, women in my limited, like, anecdotal telling to be really any more sympathetic to this woman's situation because and I will just add that what I think is interesting is that, like, for juries, right, if it's a case that has to do with abuse, usually if you were abused, you are no longer eligible to be on the jury. Of course, no one asks, like, "Did you abuse somebody?" If nobody would admit to that. So for all you know, there are people on the jury that have abused people. All the people who can speak of having had that abuse background are off. So is it really a jury of your peers anyway? Like, because can they really envision and understand what you were dealing with? I would say almost always no.
Right. Yeah, it's a way to skew the jury panel. Yeah,
Yeah.
for sure. And again, unless the defense is able to sort of really break down and explain what sort of the domestic violence, abuse, battered women syndrome. And even when that evidence is presented, jurors are often dismissive of it, particularly when the prosecution has paraded a whole different narrative.
Yeah, I think I remember Nikki's lawyer telling me that they've been told, like, "Whatever you do, don't use battered woman syndrome," that it just does not work. I think now and correct me if I believe now, like, you bring in something like the effects of trauma or, like, the after effects, something like that instead of battered women syndrome, but still, there's very little education available, and I think when it comes down to it, these women just if the real concern is, like, a danger to society, these women just are not a danger to society. You just don't find in they did something in one situation, one distinct situation.
It's an interesting situation because, on the one hand, there's this potential defense. There's, battered women syndrome or something like that. On the other hand, there's straight self defense. But you also write about how traditional self defense law doesn't really apply or doesn't really work or fails people who are survivors of abuse. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the imminence element is a big part of that. Like, a big part of self-defense is that you prove that you were in danger right in that moment and you reacted to that danger, with lethal force, say, but that it was justified because you had like a reasonable imminent fear. So I think that imminence and that requirement, to my mind, um, has very little to do with the realistic perception of danger of somebody who's been abused in a house for many, many years. Um, and also, since self-defense law, I believe, was designed with the idea of like basically two men in fisticuffs outside a bar in a brawl, it, it doesn't really take into account mostly the size and strength differentials between a man and a woman. So, um, that is why, like, again, the perfect victim is a dead one. In most cases, if a woman were to fight exactly as the self-defense law would perfectly want her, she would just be dead. Like, she would not win that fight. So
Right.
often women are do like Nikki did, you know, uh, do it when he was sitting down, when he was lying down. TC also did that. Because if he were standing up, he would kill her. But that is not taken into account. Um, at all in the letter of the law, as far as I can tell.
Yeah. I know you titled your book Unreasonable Women, and I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about why you chose that title.
Yeah, so self-defense law, right, has this requirement of the reasonable person. Um, that's another element of the law where it's weird to me, but I guess they couldn't think of something better. So I found it sort of interesting. You are supposed to judge. I think this is in other elements of the law as well, but in self-defense, you're typically supposed to judge, would a reasonable person, like there's a hypothetical reasonable person that the jury is supposed to imagine themselves as, in a way. So the question they're supposed to ask themselves, would a reasonable person, knowing what this person knew and being in that situation, have acted in the same way? Was there a reason? Was it, and this reasonable person is like this imaginary person. And for almost all of time in the laws, this person was a reasonable man. It was the reasonable man standard that you were supposed to weigh someone's actions against. And over time, they amended it, a reasonable sighted man when a blind man fell into a hole, a reasonable 7-year-old child, but there was never a reasonable woman. And so I called it that, sort of a bit of a sarcastic title, um, to say, these women, they were so unreasonable doing what they had to do,
To survive, yeah.
to survive.
It's a provocative title, and it's a terrific read, and I will be sure to link in the show notes, to your book so that people can find it. It's really worth taking a look at, and it is very well written, very well researched. It's just a good read. Um, so one of the things that's been happening nationally, as you sort of mentioned, and I don't want to overstate it, but there's a number of states now that have passed some form of domestic survivor act in which women who have were sentenced to a crime can have a look back, right? Have a court maybe consider whether their abuse was a factor or contributing factor to their case. And for folks who are being charged, it can be a mitigating factor as they consider what to do with their case. What's your take on those domestic survivor acts?
I think the whole system is really uh, disastrous. But I do say that, like, for people who are in prison, these acts are really important because there are so few apertures with which people can apply for a second chance, can look for some way out. And in states where there aren't these laws, there's just, for the most part, no way out of prison, no matter what. So I think they're really important because they provide that opening. These are laws that, yeah, like, you can, if you, in New York State, for example, Domestic Violence Survivors Justice Act, if you can prove that abuse was like a significant contributing factor to why you took part in your crime, then you're eligible for sentencing relief. And that's how Nikki ended up getting out as well. It was because of that law. And it wasn't successful at first in her case because it just went back to her trial judge, who was totally on board with what the jury and the prosecutor said. Um, but they were able to take it to appeal, and it was sort of a landmark case, and it helps other women. So I think these laws, I think any law that allows people the opportunity for a second chance, that allows people with a good case, particularly, to go forward and be seen again, is a boon. And in the states that they don't have them, but I will say that they're kind of coming down the pipeline pretty significantly in a lot of states. They're up for legislator, and I would say that like left wing and right wing are both for these for the most part, which is a surprising thing to say. I believe there's one in Louisiana up for to be possibly signed into law, and it's sponsored by like a major like Trump Republican is sponsoring that. Um,
Oh,
so it's just I
right. I
know
mean,
were they the I didn't pay that much attention. Were they the like Republicans pushed that through? Did they? Okay.
yes, and it was signed by
Yeah.
a Republican governor. It was an entirely Republican-led bill.
No, yeah. I mean, it's so it's kind of where like, but it, where a lot of the groundwork is done by like radical, feminist abolitionists is done that they're doing a lot of the groundwork for these things that they're being signed through by these like, MAGA Trump Republicans. So it's just an interesting space. But I'm just for these laws because I think that they provide an opportunity for a lot of deserving people to have a second chance, but also I think that they create a bit of a cooling effect in how prosecutors go on these because, I think you're less likely to win. You're more likely to have a big problem. And so I do think they sort of create this other effect that we don't really necessarily see, where judges and prosecutors treat the cases differently because they don't want stuff overturned. They don't want to lose. So I think it has that effect as well.
Or an educational effect, right? Maybe it's really sort of just bringing to the fore how trauma and abuse can lead to or contribute to acts of violence later.
If you're feeling generous, yes, an educational effect. I like didn't give them that, but yeah, yeah.
The stories of the women that you focus on, some of them actually have okay endings. I'm wondering, can you tell us how they're doing? Like where they are, what's happened, how they're doing?
Yeah, and it's not a spoiler because the book is really about what happened and how this happened, and about women in prison in general and why survivors of violence are in prison. But I also think the book is about just being a woman in America with the violence that we live with. So I think it would help a lot of people understand a little bit more about their own story. But the women themselves in the book, I would say they're really good, you know? Um, there's still the trauma of incarceration and of what happened to them before, but like of the women, the majority are free. So TC is like amazing. She's in California working, like truly living her best life. Says she puts her feet on the ground in the morning. She's just so happy that they're not on a concrete floor. And she just didn't take any time at all to I mean, she was in for 32 years.
Right.
Um, but she just went straight out and made a life for herself in her late 50s, early 60s, like truly has made a life for herself. Gemma is reunited with her daughter who really needed her. Um